You know what? There are so many reasons to be excited and optimistic about our future. So many cracks of light in our world right now. People who are out there courageously blazing new trails and leading the way towards a world where people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. I want you to hear their ideas and let them inspire you to see this time we're in as a fascinating time of transformation. Welcome to the Cracks of Light podcast. I am your host, Laura Storm. Throughout this podcast series, we will co-create a leadership manifesto for a thriving world. Please feel free to join us by going to my website, www.laura-storm.com. And now to episode 5, The Business Plan for Peace, with Scilla Elworthy, who's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times. Scilla has dedicated her entire life to mobilizing peace, and that passion woke in her already as a child when she was watching TV and saw Soviet tanks rolling into Budapest hurting people. Immediately, she started packing her bags. "What are you doing?" her mother said. "I am going to Budapest. They're doing some awful things there and I have to go to stop that." Her mother convinced her to stay and promised to offer Scilla the right training to help bring about peace. A promise she delivered on, and today Scilla can reflect back on an entire lifetime spent building peace in high-pressure conflict zones all around the world. I met Scilla this May at a leadership retreat facilitated by the World Spiritual University, and I was immediately drawn to the wisdom and peace that Scilla emanates with her entire being. In this episode, we talk about her most recent book, The Business Plan for Peace. How to divest from war, if peace really is possible, and how to reduce conflict everywhere from your workplace, community, home, and even inside yourself. Scilla offers plenty of fascinating stories from the front lines of building peace and gives us concrete tools to help us all identify who we really are, how to become better leaders, how to connect with our own inner guidance system, and how to combat that desire for revenge that we may all have experienced. I promise you'll be inspired, motivated, and excited about the future. Let's start. Scilla, welcome on the Cracks of Light podcast. And I'm very excited to talk to you today because what we need in a new thriving world is definitely peace. So I would like to know, because you have fought for peace your entire lifetime, and for that effort you've been nominated the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times. But is peace really possible, or is revenge and violence too ingrained in the human nature? Is there hope?
Definitely, there's more than hope, because there's so much going on below the radar of the media that will astonish you as I tell you a little bit about it. But first of all, what I'd like to say is that I believe that in general, in the words of somebody who was at Standing Rock, we're being farmed for fear. I think that's an extraordinary encapsulation of the fact that the media enjoys magnifying stories of horror and terror and revenge, and is very unwilling and not excited about what's happening really on the ground by the literally thousands, probably hundreds of thousands now, of people in areas of very harsh and hot armed conflict. People are actually risking their lives to stop other people getting killed. So I'll enjoy telling you how that's happening as we progress with our conversation.
It's good to know that there's hope coming from one of the people on the front line. But I would also like to talk about this feeling of being a bit hopeless when we turn on the TV, because there's so many wars and conflicts going on all around the world. And to many people, it can be too much to take in, so they shut off. It's just what has happened in my field of climate change and sustainability. It's unpleasant and it's complex, and people feel powerless. And to address this and provide concrete action points, you've just published your recent book, Business Plan for Peace. And that book has the mission of outlining how we can all make a difference and help create peace. So, what can I do to create peace?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start with what other people are doing and then come to what you can do. So, where we start in this book is 25 working examples, people actually doing this right now, taking actions that stop war before it starts, that ameliorate the effects of war, and enable people to find other ways of resolving their differences. Let me give you one example. Gululai Ismail lives in northwestern Pakistan, and that's probably one of the hardest and toughest places in the world to be a woman. She started when she was 15, getting young girls into school, along with her colleague Malala, who you probably remember got shot in the head for doing that. Completely deterred, Gululai went on, and now, aged 26, she has trained 250 young people, young men and women, to go into the madrasas or schools where young men are being trained for jihad, and go home with them to their families and talk through why the Quran would not accept suicide bombing as a form of jihad. And they have so far dissuaded 203 suicide bombers from carrying out their intent. Now, that's the kind of thing we're talking about, that the media doesn't cover, that is below the radar, and is happening now all over the world. May I give you an example, some very brief numbers of why and how this is developing so fast? When we started my organization, Peace Direct, in 1999, we did a survey of how many effective peace-building initiatives there were in the world. And we were able to identify 350 that were viable and effective. We did the same exercise last year, and now there are over 1,500. So that is a 5-fold increase in the number of people working at grassroots level to actually stop killing. And this is the, if you like, the green shoots coming up through concrete that the world's media hasn't yet noticed. And one other thing I'd just like to say, you said that everything seems to be getting worse and worse and more conflict. That's actually not true. There are actually fewer people now dying from armed conflict than there are people who are actually committing suicide, even just in the United States. So what is being exaggerated out there is, we have an expression in England, if it bleeds, it leads. That means it's on the front page. And I think this is really almost a crime to keep trying to convince viewers to watch something that is violent and horrible when there's so much else that is happening that we don't learn about. So that's our starting point, which is actually measuring how violence is being met effectively by non-violence all over the world.
To come back to the question of what can I do? Me living in the western part of the world, I've never had war close to me in any way. What can I do? How can I make a difference in order to create peace on this planet?
Well, the first thing you can do is right at home, you can just learn the very simple techniques of defusing conflict by nonviolent language. The way I did this was to take a course in something called nonviolent communication. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
Well, it's a wonderful, you do a 2-day foundation course, and it just gives you the basic of how to communicate with somebody with whom you violently disagree. So basically what you do is you say to this person, would you be willing to spend 20 minutes, half an hour with me? And we'll each just talk about how we feel about what's going on between us. You invite the other person to speak first, and that person speaks in the first person and says, this is how it feels for me when. And the idea is not to accuse and not to point fingers, but to actually communicate to the other person how it feels. When that person's finished speaking, you repeat back to them what you've heard. And that's the best acknowledgement we can give anybody, is to show that we really listened to them. So they will be amazed that you listened so carefully to what they were saying. And then you say, okay, have I got it right now? And they say yes, or they add something. And then you change over and you speak in the first person about how you feel. And you also speak about what you need and what you would request in this situation. And that means that you move from the brain, the head, which says, I'm right and you're wrong, to the heart, which begins to say, oh my goodness, is that how it feels to be you? So then you have a basis for communication. And you can use that anywhere. And you can teach it to children. In fact, many schools now, they're using it as a basis for teaching children to communicate well. And you can use it at work. I've taught it to 400 senior executives of the major luxury goods firm in the world. And they reported afterwards, they said, what you taught us enables us to resolve in 15 minutes what would have taken us 4 hours and still not been solved. So these are techniques that work, and anybody can learn them very simply. In fact, I've got exercises that I share in my book and in all my workshops, and enable people to practice doing exactly that kind of communication. And that, Laura, is just one of 31 proposals or ideas or initiatives that you can undertake right here at home, at work, in your community, in your family, to build a more peaceful world.
So part of the root cause of conflict is also the lack of acknowledgement and the lack of putting ourselves in other people's shoes or position.
Exactly. When we're simply thinking about how right we are and how wrong they are, we completely forget to imagine their situation, what the pressures on them might be, what their upbringing was like, how they might have been treated as children. And so we completely fail to understand their situation, and probably they fail to understand us. So what we're looking at is a way of enabling understanding between people. And that actually stops war. May I illustrate with one other story?
Yes, please.
It's a story from a war zone. It was in 2003, shortly after the invasion of Iraq. And a young American Lieutenant Colonel, Chris Hughes, was leading his men on a foot patrol in the streets of Najaf, when you still could have a foot patrol. And these young soldiers were going down the street, and suddenly, out of the houses on both sides of the road, streamed extremely angry local people, yelling, waving their fists at the tops of their voices, shouting, and potentially enormously violent. And of course, the young soldiers didn't speak Arabic, and they were scared. And Chris Hughes, with an instant presence, strode into the middle of the street with his weapon pointed at the ground and gave his young soldiers a command that they had never heard in their lives. And it was, kneel. And so they wobbled to the ground in their heavy body armor and their helmets and with their weapons pointed at the sand. And the whole crowd grew silent. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, everybody went home. So a massacre was averted.
Wow.
By this young lieutenant colonel thinking quickly and knowing that, well, one of the root causes of conflict and war is humiliation. And what he got his men to do was to make a gesture of respect. And respect is the fastest antidote to humiliation. And to show somebody some gesture of respect or a word of respect immediately defuses a row between you. It's hard to do, but it works.
I have attended many political negotiation sessions. You have too. We have both also attended board meetings and business meetings where there sometimes can be a lot of tension and anger and frustration in the room. How can we contribute to turn situations like that around using your tools?
Well, I would take my cue from Nelson Mandela, because what he did and asked everybody, trained his colleagues to do, was to work with all the protagonists of a conflict. In other words, all the people who've got an interest in the conflict continuing. So he would go and sit with not just the people who wanted, say, this was working in Burundi when there'd been, as you know, the terrible genocide in Rwanda neighboring, and the violence was spilling over. So he went to talk to all the people who actually had an investment in violence, the drug traffickers, the arms dealers, the people who were trafficking human beings, anybody who takes advantage of chaos, as well as talking to the leaders of the various factions. So he would talk to them all separately. So the thing is, for somebody skilled, or preferably a number of skilled people, to go and really listen, not just talk, but listen to all the people who have a very strong point of view and probably disagree with one another, to enable those people to feel that they are fully heard, and then introduce them or have them talk in twos with their, as it were, opposite numbers, the people with whom they might most disagree, with one person sitting aside as a mediator. So that instead of trying to create understanding in a room with maybe 50 or 60 people, you work first of all 2 by 2, and then in 3s with the protagonists plus a mediator, and only then would you form into slightly larger groups so that you can build understanding and respect and good communication before you start to try and resolve a treaty. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so. Good advice. What is the business case for companies that are currently profiting massively from wars, like Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and companies like that? What's in it for them if we have more peace on this planet?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And I think we can begin to take our lessons from what's happening in environmental issues, because as I understand it, there is beginning a huge disinvestment or divestment program to show major oil companies, for example, and fossil fuel companies, how much more profitable it is for them to be moving into renewable sources of energy. And that is the truth, that it is becoming far more profitable for them to be going into solar, wind, or wave energy. And the same is beginning to happen just beginning to happen, the arms companies. And it's more difficult because the big arms companies have managed to persuade everybody that what we call in this country defense jobs are vital to the economy. So we've got this mantra that we can't give up selling our weapons. Britain is regularly in the top 5 arms sellers worldwide, with America, Russia, China, and so on. And we've got this myth that we have to support our economy by continuing to sell weapons. And that is just beginning to be taken apart now, that myth, with good studies underway on what's called diversification. In other words, how arms corporations can start to make socially useful goods and actually provide almost twice as many jobs using the same amount of government subsidy as they had or have now got for producing weapons. So it's beginning to show up in the numbers, which is what matters to large corporations, and also in the growing public criticism of, for example, Britain selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that then get used to bomb women, children, and old people in Yemen. So there's in the British Parliament, there's a growing criticism of these arms sales that are bringing absolute devastation to that country of Yemen, which is already very poor.
So that's also a very promising signal that there is actually also business in it for them if we divest from war.
Yeah. The other thing to add here is that I'm sure you've heard of the sovereign wealth funds. In other, the very, very big pensions investment funds. And a little while ago, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund took the decision to no longer invest in nuclear weapons production, and I think nuclear power as well. And the other wealth funds kind of laughed up their sleeves and said, well, you'll soon realize that your dividends will go down. And that didn't happen. The Norwegian wealth fund actually performed better with having divested itself from nuclear. And so that way of thinking is beginning to spread over into other areas of weapons production.
Thank you so much for that info. That is indeed very promising. I would like to know, because you have called, I'm shifting a bit here because I would like to have time to talk about how we can put our own ego in check, because ego often has a lot to say in conflicts. And you have called ego the main ill of our day. And I would like you to explain what you mean about that.
Well, let me first start by saying there's no point in trying to get rid of the ego, because it doesn't work. But what we can do is become aware of when our ego is leading our behavior. In other words, by adopting a regular practice of self-observation, self-reflection, we can develop a kind of helicopter view of what we're up to. So instead of just being prey to our irritation or our frustration or our ambition or our jealousy and spitting it out at some other person, we're actually able to observe ourselves doing that. And once you get that ability to see what you're doing, then that's 3/4 of the way to being able to behave differently, to have choice in how you behave. So the ego will do anything to make you feel more important, to have you not left out, to defend yourself if you're attacked, to push yourself forward to get ahead of the game. All those things, nothing wrong with any of that. But in my experience, my ego lands me into conflict and into problems with my colleagues, my friends, and so on. I'll give you a good example. When I began my work on nuclear weapons back in the early 80s, I was driven by anger and fear. I was driven by anger about the terrible waste of money and the danger that fissile materials, uranium and plutonium, were posing for human beings, and fear that there would be a nuclear war. And my daughter was only very young, and I dreaded the idea that there would be a nuclear war. And there very nearly was in 1983. We were about 12 minutes away from a full-scale nuclear war between the then Soviet Union and United States. So my hunch was correct. But I was driven by anger and fear. And as I began to do this research on who actually made the decisions on nuclear weapons worldwide, I was angry with those people. And that didn't work at all. So I couldn't open a dialogue with them when I was angry. So I had to deal with my own ego in the sense of I'm right and you're wrong. I knew the moral high ground like the back of my hand, let me say. I was morally superior, and I had to deal with that before I could begin to set up a system whereby I could invite these very powerful men, people who designed the warheads, people who signed the checks, people who deployed the nuclear weapons, very, very senior people from the United States, China, Russia, France, and Britain, and get them to come to sort of below the radar meetings and actually talk to their opposite numbers, whom they didn't know, and to their critics. And it was those meetings that eventually succeeded because we were able to enable people to meet as human beings, not as a big important person in this or that position. And the results of those meetings, beginning to lay the basis of treaties, was what we got the nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize for.
When can we know when our ego is at play in an unhealthy way?
I get it physiologically. I get a feeling I've got the bit between my teeth. Do you know that expression? Like a horse that's bolting. It's like I get a feeling of inflation, that I'm slightly bigger than myself. And it has a feeling of power over other people rather than power with. Does that make sense? So it's all those little signals that are, so uncomfortable to look at. But they are signals that the ego is out of control. Will probably do something that I will deeply regret in the future. And I'm always, when my ego's in this sort of commanding position, I always override my intuition. And there are 3 times in my life that I have, in a big way, overridden my intuition. And in each case, it was an absolute disaster. So,
can you tell us one of those things?
Okay. Well, I've always wanted peace to go up the public radar, to become popular, to become a bit more like it was several decades ago, a sort of popular. Peace was popular. Now it's a bit of a dirty word. And so a young man approached me who was going to have a massive peace festival and concerts with 450,000 people and major bands and dropping all kinds of enormously big names about how it was going to happen. And he was a tremendous showman. And there was something, a little voice inside me that said, is this quite right? Is this really what you ought to be doing? But I overrode that and went along with his plans and brought my knowledge and expertise to what he wanted to do. And the whole thing crumbled. It was all a pack of cards, really. And people lost a lot of money, and people lost trust. Many people had trusted me to get involved in this, and it was such a disaster. And I was deeply, deeply shocked and sad that I'd overridden my intuition and obeyed my ego.
But when can we know? I think it's difficult to know, when is it your intuition and your inner guidance system that is communicating to you, and when is it your ego's desire?
Oh,
What do you do to tell the difference?
I just go into silence. You know, if a daily practice of some kind of reflection, it doesn't really matter whether you're good at meditation or anything like that. That doesn't matter. What matters is, can you have 10 minutes at least a day where you simply listen, where you ask your mind to kindly shut up and get quiet, and maybe light a candle or look at an image that you really love, or smell a flower, something like that, and allow your mind to slow down and get quiet. And then you can ask the question, what am I up to? What's going on here? Is this my ego? How could I be more wise? And in that silent listening, in that moment of calm, you will know. You will definitely know. Your inner voice will tell you.
Is that something you practice daily?
Yes. Not always for very long. Sometimes it's 10 minutes. Last night, for example, I woke up at 3:30 worrying about a business issue. And I was, tossing and turning and couldn't sleep. And so I got up, and because I'm English, I made a cup of tea and I got back into bed. And I just lit a candle and looked at an image of a beautiful Chinese goddess. And slowly, slowly, my mind calmed down. And slowly, slowly, my inner voice emerged. So that was a much longer process, but it was so fruitful. The wisdom that just kind of, fell out of, you call your program cracks of light. It was as though wisdom was falling through these lovely cracks of light in my gloomy, fraught, worried mind.
Speaking of that, and speaking of surrendering to silence and let oneself be embraced by that, I know you and I share a similar experience. When our daughters were very young, my daughter was 2 years old when my brain injury happened. Your daughter was, I think I recall it, 6 weeks. She was an infant at least, right? When you had a disease that caused an inflation in your brain. And for those two incidents, for both of us, were in many ways very dark, and we both kept asking ourselves the questions of, who am I? I mean, in my case, I wasn't able to do any of the things that I had used to do. And my inner passionate warrior were feeling so hopeless and desperate because my physical body was not able to do anything. And I know that you experienced a bit of the same. And in your case, it lasted, as I recall, 6 years. And I think your experience and what way that has catapulted you into your path, but also helping you to kind of reach more deeply inside of you, will be very valuable for the listeners. Can you tell us a bit about that experience of asking the very, very big questions of who am I and what am I here for, and surrendering to your inner deep nature?
Oh, bless you. Well, it's synchronistic that we both had a similar experience. And I got this disease called encephalitis living in southern Africa. And it put me in a coma for 2 weeks when my daughter was, as you say, only 6 weeks old. So I had to stop feeding her, which was a disaster. And I was just unconscious. So I couldn't do very much. And then terrible, terrible headaches, worse than migraines, for 6 years. And in that foggy state, with my brain literally like a fog, there was one question that went round and round in my brain, and that was, who am I? Who am I? And because I'd never in my life done anything like meditation or had any spiritual experience or even read any books, I had no clue how to even begin to answer that question of who am I. But eventually I found my way to somebody who was able to help me. Gradually over the next 6 years, began to find ways to answer that question. And I think who am I is one of the key questions for our existence. You know, why am I here? What is my path? What's the point of my life, my human incarnation? And when we begin to find the answer to that question, it is such a relief, because then we know what we're meant to be doing. You know, those kind of people who are born as a young child, they are obviously going to be a pianist and grow up to do nothing so brilliantly as being a concert pianist. There's no question that that's what they're going to do. And it's that kind of discovery of, yes, this is my identity, this is my calling, if you like, this is what fulfills my life. Did you have something similar?
Completely. And it has been quite a powerful experience that I still haven't wrapped my head around and are able to put into words. But I was stripped of everything. But what has been mind-blowing to me is that even though I haven't yet recovered 100%, I've never felt stronger or happier, more present, more content. And I still can't put my finger on why that is. Because as I said, I have been stripped of everything and I've been through quite a traumatic experience, because it's heartbreaking, especially when you are the mother of a young child, to not be able to do anything for such a long time. But it's still an experience that I'm incredibly thankful for, because it feels like I am now completely in sync with my whole being. But what can people do? What would be your advice to people who are not going through an experience that you and I did? How could they go through and get in touch with themselves and be able to answer the who am I questions without that? What would be your advice?
For me, being in nature is where I get closest to truthful questions and truthful answers. And so I would encourage a person who was searching to spend as much time as they could alone in nature. If you like a desert, find a way that you can spend 3 or 4 days maybe fasting in the desert in a safe environment, you know, going with some other people who want to do the same, but being completely secluded on your own for 2 or 3 days, maybe 4, and don't eat and just drink plenty of water. That's one way. It's a bit like a vision quest, and it's very helpful because all the normal interruptions of the day and media and the phone and all the rest of it are absent. So I think that's what I would find the easiest and the fastest way. There are plenty of people now who will lead retreats of that kind and enable you.
Because my experience has made me very, what can I say, motivated to spread that experience to leaders, because it has made me more compassionate. It has made me more patient. And I was the most impatient person ever on this planet. At least that's what I felt like. So I'm keen on seeing how can we encourage more leaders to have a similar experience without having to go through the trauma, but actually daring to surrender to silence and dig a bit deeper instead of constantly being on a very superficial solving problem level.
It depends who the leaders are, but in most of our experience, many leaders are actually propelled to their positions by their ego. So the ego is pretty strong. And nothing wrong with that, because if they're good leaders, they will use that compulsion to do the right thing and lead in a very sensible way. So with a leader, it often requires a very special kind of conversation to interest them in that notion of their real path. However, I would encourage anybody who knows such a leader to ask them to sit down together for half an hour and just put some questions about, you are clearly a gifted leader, but what is it really that you want to accomplish in the world? What is it that really would make you feel when you're older that you've given a great gift to your country or your business or your community? What would you be really proud of? What's the closest thing to your heart's fulfillment that you can imagine that you could do? It's those kind of questions that most of our leaders don't have time or inclination to ask themselves. Very often, if somebody does ask them those questions, it hooks something deep within them that they really do want to concentrate on. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But I think it's worth asking those questions. But you do need to request from them a half an hour's quiet conversation.
Good advice. The final question before the question that I ask all my guests on the Cracks of Light podcast when we are creating the manifesto is it's just a simple question, but very complex. What can people do to not be inclined to seek revenge? Because I think we have all experienced that on some level, that when people do us wrong, it's a natural human instinct to seek revenge. But what can we do to combat that?
Well, revenge very often involves humiliating the other person, and that never, ever works. It always will have a backlash. So revenge is actually unworkable. I don't know, apart from killing somebody else, which might get them out of the way, but that's, a terrible length to go to. I think revenge is just such an impractical way of dealing with your feelings. So what I would suggest is that the person who wants to take revenge steps back for a moment and just looks into their own heart and says, when have I done what this person has just done to me? When have I done that? And sure as anything, if you allow it, an example, a past experience will pop up that shows that if I do that, I always find, oh my God, I did that. Once you know that you have been capable of doing what this person that you hate or are so angry with, that you have been capable of doing what they did to you and you did it to someone else, you feel very differently and feel much more human to them. And you don't have to do anything. You just leave it alone. Yeah.
And maybe find some strength in doing exactly that.
Yeah.
So the Cracks of Light podcast series is all about pointing towards a new thriving paradigm for people, planet, and profit. And in that process, we are co-creating a leadership manifesto for a thriving world with both my guest and listeners. So all listeners can provide feedback on what they believe should be in such a leadership manifesto for a thriving world. And based on your experience and know-how, what do you think must be two key principles in such a leadership manifesto?
The first one would be self-knowledge, because leaders who know themselves, who have self-inspected, who have a regular practice of reflection, those are the wise ones. And here Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, is my model. And he says, if you want peace, don't talk to your friends, talk to your enemies. And so that's real self-knowledge. And from that, I would derive the other most important principle to me, which is being able to listen to those you hate or despise or despair of or disdain or generally think ill of. If you can listen to them, it takes huge wisdom, but wisdom is the bedrock of great leadership. And we know it when we see it. My goodness, we do. We know it when we see it. Think of Martin Luther King or any of those extraordinary people who have brought about massive change in the world. The basis of their leadership was self-knowledge and listening and wisdom, developing wisdom.
Thank you so much, Scilla. Anything you want to tell our listeners that we haven't addressed yet, please feel free to do that.
Oh, yes, I would love to. I believe that the kind of people who I imagine are listening to this podcast are what I would call beings of light. In other words, people who are shedding light on their community or their work, who are actively seeking to build a world that works well for everybody. And I would encourage you to actually see yourself bringing light in the midst of this rather dark age that we seem to be living through. It's an age of massive transformation, and we who've had a glimpse of the lighter way of being and the lighter way of living our lives, we have a job to do. And that job is to spread light, to bring light. And I don't mean it in a sort of airy-fairy, gossamer sort of, clouds in the sky and angels and stuff. No, not that. This is about living your day. Today's the day to live as a person of light. And it's a lovely way to live. I wish you well.
Scilla, I'm one big smile right now. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for your contribution, your entire lifetime, but also in the past 45 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cracks of Light podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please help me make the Cracks of Light bigger and brighter in this world by sharing this with your network. Together, we can build a world where people, planet, and profit collectively thrive. And if you have input to the Cracks of Light Leadership Manifesto, please go to my website, www.laura-storm.com. I would love to hear from you. Take care.